Welcome to the Victoria Anarchist Book Fair's week of podcasts featuring local, national, and international activists and authors. Due to the ongoing global pandemic, the Book Fair Collective decided to move their event online again this year. So for the second year in a row, From Embers is teaming up with the Victoria Anarchist Book Fair to release presentations over our podcast platform. Recordings of these voices of resistance were conducted on unceded Indigenous territories across so-called British Columbia and beyond. For more information about the book fair and a full schedule of online events this week, check out victoriaanarchistbookfair.ca, and listeners in the Victoria area are encouraged to visit Camas Books at 2620 Quadra Street or online at camas.ca for anarchist publications and more. And to find out more about our regular anarchist podcast, go to fromembers.libsyn.com or simply search From Embers in your favorite podcast app.
The Victoria Anarchist Book Fair Collective would like to acknowledge the interview you're about to hear took place simultaneously on unceded Wasanic and Lekwungen territories in so-called Victoria, Canada, and on the territories of the sovereign Hawaiian nation. My name is Alan Etliff. Today I'm interviewing Hawaiian activist and land defender Kahala Johnson. Kahala, some listeners may not be familiar with the historical colonization of the Hawaiian Islands. Could you give us a brief summary of that process?
Yes, it's actually quite a tale. So beginning in around the late 1700s, one of our chiefs, his name is Kamehameha I, engaged in a war to conquer the main islands, Hawaii, Oahu, Maui, Mauna Kea, and Lanai. And following this, one of his wives, Ka'ahumanu, later incorporated Kauai and Niihau through an arranged relation with those islands' chiefs. After this kind of initial, what people say, unification or conquering of the islands, it was followed by a period of Hawaiian statecraft, which occurred from 1810 to about 1893. And this statecraft eventually led to the recognition of what we call the Hawaiian Kingdom as a sovereign and independent nation state. And that was done largely under Kamehameha and Ka'ahumanu's child or successor, King Kauikeoli, who's known as Kamehameha III. The recognition of the Hawaiian Kingdom as a sovereign nation state was achieved through a couple of real key geopolitical events. First was the creation of an 1839 Declaration of Rights and an 1840 Constitution, which provided the legal parameters that defined the territorial boundaries, the population and its citizenship requirements, as well as a form of government that was to be established within Hawaii, which was going to be a constitutional monarchy. Second, it was the defense and control of that territorial population and government through the exclusion of competing sovereigns. So during this period, Europe and America were exploring the Pacific. But in 1839, this bourgeoisie or nascent kingdom was able to push out the French in 1839 and later the British in 1843. And among other attempted invasions and seizures, the Hawaiian Kanaka leadership was successful at excluding those competing sovereigns. Third, there was a hybridization of private property laws, which were hybridized with native land tenure during an event called the Mahele Nui. So a lot of people say that this was kind of like the entrance of private property regimes into Hawaii, where before we didn't own any of the land. There was no such thing as property. That's something that's foreign. And so some people thought that this was kind of an incursion, but there are other scholars who study this as not just the uncritical adoption of private property, but it actually had a hybridization with pre-existing native traditions of land tenure. which were not based on property. And so the mahele nui in this event, which saw the apportioning, dividing, and sharing of the land, was grounded both in Hawaiian practices of what we call kalai'aina, carving the land, but it also resembled, in a legal sense, a kind of a foreign quiet title procedure, which occurred between the crown, the chiefs, and the commoners. Very important geopolitical development. Fourth was the recognition of the Hawaiian Kingdom by other sovereign states and its participation in diplomacy, which began with the 1843 Anglo-Franco Proclamation, and which was followed by a series of bilateral treaties with countries in Europe, America, Asia, and Oceania. And lastly, in these kind of geopolitical developments, it's an unofficial requirement, but it was part of the missionary process of Christian missionaries and churches in the islands, which brought this civilizing agenda. And so one of the other geopolitical events was the entrance of Christianity as a structuring theology, and its influence was felt on the kingdom. And so you could see, like, patriarchal and capitalist domestication of the kingdom to make it align with, with Western patriarchal forms of property ownership, with the patriarchal state, and particularly with the white Protestant nuclear family. And so once the leadership of the kingdom had met all these geopolitical standards for sovereignty, the Hawaiian Kingdom would eventually enter into the family of nations. And after that, they even attempted to create an oceanic confederation with Samoa, other Polynesian countries during the reign of Kalakaua. And that was done as a way to resist Euro-American imperialism in the Pacific. However, despite all these attempts to secure sovereignty and recognition as an independent country, the Hawaiian Kingdom would eventually experience an American military-backed coup d'etat in 1893, which would have severe political consequences even up to the present day. So in 1893, a small group of white missionary descendants called the Committee of Safety, led by Lauren Thurston and Sanford B. Dole, conspired with the U.S. Foreign Minister John L. Stevens to betray the Hawaiian government. And they enlisted the support of the American military to stage a coup d'etat against the reigning monarch at the time, Queen Liliuokalani. This Committee of Safety sought to annex Hawaii to the United States, and they were motivated by business interests in the sugar industry. Queen Liliuokalani, on her part, in order to prevent bloodshed during this revolt, this rebellion, she yielded the authority of her executive office to the United States president at the time, Grover Cleveland, who she trusted would declare the overthrow an insurgency and return her to power. For Cleveland's part, amazingly, the US president at this time did recognize the coup d'etat as an act of war, and he began an investigation into the events leading up to the overthrow. And eventually, he even issued a couple of executive orders to restore the Queen's authority to her. While this was going on between Grover Cleveland and the Queen, there were insurgents from the Committee of Safety who attempted to annex the kingdom to the US, but they were stopped by President Cleveland, Congress, the American Congress at the time, and the actions of a domestic group called the Hui Aloha Aina, who were anti-annexationists, who went around the islands collecting like thousands of signatures on this petition, demanding that the Queen be restored and or that annexation not occur. And so these defiant acts succeeded at first and halted the efforts of the Committee of Safety and insurgents at annexing the Hawaii to the United States. So while their efforts had initially failed, these insurgents declared their own provisional government and then a Republic of Hawaii. And they seized control of government affairs, and they continued to press for annexation despite all this resistance from Hawaiians and the citizens of the Hawaiian Kingdom, who also included non-Hawaiians as well. There was even an armed counterinsurgency that one of my ancestors was involved in, which was the Robert Wilcox counterinsurgent revolution in 1895. It didn't pan out. They were discovered, but you it's part of the history of us not accepting annexation to the United States. Unfortunately, the pro-annexationists and the insurgents did gain the advantage after Grover Cleveland left office and William McKinley was elected to the presidency in 1897. For those who don't know, McKinley was a staunch American imperialist, and he was responsible for overseeing the Spanish-American War, which began in Cuba in 1898, and eventually led to the acquisition of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines as U.S. colonies. During the Spanish-American War, McKinley used that conflict as a rationale for occupying the Hawaiian Islands, and later supported the illegal annexation of Hawaii by a joint resolution in 1898. And that joint resolution was a domestic measure on the part of the United States. It had no equal treaty from the Hawaiian Kingdom, and so this joint resolution is seen as a point of contestation that attempts to dispel this myth of Hawaii being annexed to the United States. But in any case, from 1898 to 1959, Hawaii was treated as a territory of the United States, but was listed on the United Nations Registry of Non-Self-Governing Territories in 1946. However, Hawaii was removed from the list in 1959, mysteriously, but not so mysteriously, due to the passage of the Admissions Act, which ostensibly made us the 50th state of the Union. And so that's another point of contestation by folks who are looking at the UN protocols for decolonization. They see this as the United States wanting to maintain hold of Hawaii and therefore using statehood as a way to bypass decolonization protocols. During this period, there was a concentrated effort to Americanize Kanaka Maoli through de-racination. And Kehalani Kau'uanui talks about this in her book, Blood Quantum, and so forth. And there was also this effort to denationalize Hawaiians. Dr. Keaunusai talks about this in his more recent articles discussing the stripping away of the national consciousness of Hawaiians as belonging to a Hawaiian kingdom, and instead the kind of assimilation of Hawaiian consciousness as, we're part of America, we're the 50th state, etc. Also during this period, 1959 and onward, or actually even before that, the Hawaiian language was institutionally suppressed. It was seen as undesirable, which prevented us from accessing the hundreds of newspapers which have the history of Hawaiian Kingdom statecraft, as well as the resistance to Euro-American domination. Hawaiian lands and waters were also settled during this period, first by plantation economy, and then by military tourism complex, which ended up justifying U.S. imperial expansion into the Pacific during the Cold War and post-Cold War period. Culturally, we experienced what a lot of other Black and Indigenous people of color faced: racist blood quantum laws, assimilation of education systems, Indian reservation-style homesteading, and the stigmatization, queering of our kinship, etc. But even through all of this, our ancestors still resisted and even innovated, not just those who were on island, but also those who were off island in the diaspora. And it's this resistance that would eventually produce movements in Hawaii to stop the bombing of Kaho'olawe, with George Helm, to create housing sanctuaries in Makua and Kalama Valley for Hawaiians and other people of color being evicted by large-scale corporate housing development. It was also led to the fight for Hawaiian sovereignty and self-determination that we know through Haunani Kitras, one of our preeminent parents of the Hawaiian sovereignty movement, also scholar, educated in the diaspora. And it eventually led to the types of movements we saw to protect mountains like Haleakala and Mauna Kea in 2015 onward. Okay. So that's like the big tale. Right now, currently, Hawaiian politics is in a very agonistic situation with regard to like this history of statecraft, and this is where kind of like anarchist analyses and ways of looking at the situation are really important. So there are some Hawaiians, some Kanaka Maoli who prefer the assimilationist route to various degrees. They've accepted that more or less statehood occurred. Some of the examples of that kind of effort is the attempts to achieve federal and state recognition of Kanaka Maoli as an indigenous people or tribe of the United States. I'm not with that crowd for many, many reasons that's beyond the scope of this. But there are others in Hawaiian politics, the political situation, who are emphasizing decolonization, and a lot of them turn back to that UN definition and the process and protocol of decolonization with the list and Hawaii being taken off that list and whatnot. But decolonization also includes engagements with like white and Asian settler colonialism in Hawaii, particularly with the ways that white and Asian settler structures serve to eliminate Hawaiians from our own lands. Still others take a kind of a strict, what we call a deoccupation framework, which follows UN international humanitarian laws and protocols of occupation and deoccupation. Deoccupation advocates, they often reject both the assimilation, we're part of the United States kind of route, as well as the decolonization approaches in many, if not all of those forms. And the way they do that is that they argue that the Hawaiian Kingdom was never an American state, and it was also not an American colony, and therefore it continues to remain a sovereign country, albeit occupied by the United States in the present. You also have, like, beyond these kind of three main classifications, you also have folks engaged in research and direct action and organizing on the ground, movements that include, addressing houselessness, the protection of ancestral burials and artifacts. I don't like that word. It's just, that they're all our ancestors. You have folks who are reoccupying the land, folks who are involved in language revitalization, demilitarization movements, food sovereignty, financial sovereignty, prison and police abolition, labor unions, feminist LGBTQ issues, environmental healing, spiritual ritual recovery, and even transnational solidarity between Palestine, Melanesia, Micronesia, Black, and Native Americans. So it's a lot, and that's kind of the tale that I want to share today to answer that question.
Okay.
So you identify as an anarchist. Can you tell us how your own indigeneity has shaped your conception of anarchism? What's the relationship between your indigeneity and the conception of anarchism that you've developed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a complex relationship for me. So indigeneity shapes my concept of anarchism in both positive and negative ways. I'll explain what that means. From a positive perspective, I tend to draw on the indigeneity of my ancestors that I descend from. So one of those ancestors is named Pele Pele, who is associated with the volcano on Hawaii Island, as well as the mountain Haleakala on Maui, where I'm from. The Pele family or the Pele clan is known for a couple of practices which have been real central to my ideas and understanding of anarcha-indigenism. One of those practices is this concept of hulihia. Huli means to turn. Hia is kind of a pacifization prefix, which renders the word as overturned. And this idea of overturn is related to volcanic and tectonic activities of the earth. Pele, as a deity associated with fire, the volcano, as well as earthquakes, all these kinds of geological processes, provides this idea of hulihia as this overturning. So whenever there's an eruption or an earthquake that occurs, and the land is thrown into upheaval, that's what we call hulihia. That's what we would say hulihia keo. Yeah, the period of time that we're in is in upheaval. Hulihia is also a way of describing the geodynamic revolutions of convection and subduction that occur in the Earth's mantle. So whenever the plates subduct beneath the Earth and turn, that turning is what we would call hulihia. But as well, in addition to that, is the upwelling of molten material from the middle of the core of the Earth upwards. That also is known as a hulihia. And so these two kind of turning admixture of the elements of the Earth beneath us is also part of that process. We oftentimes look at the volcanic one, and it's exciting, big events. But Hulihia is not just those, periodic eruptions. It's also the turning within the earth that produces islands, continents, even our, magnetic field holding the atmosphere together. So Hulihia as a kind of this geodynamic concept associated with my clan. It's also used for situations of political revolution or uprising. Ironically, in the Hawaiian language newspapers, Hulihia is also one of the words that are used to describe the 1893 overthrow by the Committee of Safety, as well as the 1898 illegal annexation. But those references are really more regarding the disastrous consequences of that for Hawaiians. Hulihia has also been used to describe the current pandemic, as well as the unknown potential of better or worse worlds to come. Hulihia is one of those concepts where, we just don't know. We only know that there's creativity, there's novelty, there's transformation, change, often violent, but not just violent. There's also this life-giving aspect to it. But it's a mixture of all that. And really, during a period of Hulihia, we don't really ascribe good, bad, balanced, imbalanced. It just is a phenomenon that you get through. And it oftentimes is disastrous to those who experience it. But from the perspective of Kanaka, that's the lands, particularly Pele and other earth deities, being and doing what they do. And so it's a recognition of kind of the place of Kanaka Maoli in relation to the land, in relation to our ancestors, and in relation to, it gives us this idea that really challenges sovereignty. Yeah, these ideas of like the state owning the property, owning people and controlling them and all that. Because, when that eruption comes up, there's not much you can do. And it's a very important aspect for Hawaiian culture to realize that connection to land, and also that deference to the land and our ancestors. So in addition to kind of like conceiving of revolution as like this event and this ongoing process regarding Hulihia, Hulihia really allows me personally to look at and pay attention to the marks or the memories, I would say, left by Hawaiian political activity in the past that are left upon the strata of Hawaiian history that we're uncovering today as descendants of these colonial occupying interruptions into our lifestyles, our lives. And it particularly for me it's important for how those marks of political activity provide for like a genealogical look, not at like this static or like conformist history, but rather this history of dynamic movement, action, transformation, creativity, and especially defiance. And so, for these reasons, Hulihia to me is a Hawaiian philosophy with a strong affinity for anarchist practice, especially concerning resistance and defiance to the patriarchal state and capitalist property ownership. So as an example, for when Pele erupted on Hawaii Island in 2018, she caused the Hulihia. Interestingly, in that, when that was happening, from my perspective, from the clan's perspective, the ancestor doesn't care whether the land is owned by the United States, whether it's owned by the Hawaiian Kingdom. The land is her, right? Like that's her, and she's reclaiming herself. And really, it even just goes beyond this idea of owning and possessing and whatnot, because she's really just giving birth to herself again and again and again. But in doing so, in simply, giving birth to herself, she's challenging the laws of the United States and the Hawaiian Kingdom. And I think there's something there that, allows us to think of Hulihia as this practice which says, the United States, the Hawaiian Kingdom state, the nation states, property ownership under capitalist regimes, the control of, women's bodies, all of that. Like, we sometimes feel like we have to, I think that's why we have to negotiate a lot of those terms. But then we have our ancestor today who, is just giving birth to herself. And in doing so, she completely overturns Hulihia's all of those structures. And it causes a wonderful disaster, in my opinion, for to the state, to the ideas of property ownership. That also gives it gives me another concept that we have in the Pele clan. So Pele is known as a deity who we use the word noho. Noho means to like live, habituate, or dwell, but it can also be used for like possession in the spiritual sense. Now, this is really interesting because the word possession is wrapped up with ideas of property and whatnot. But when in these kinds of Hulihia events, when an eruption is about to take place, the land around the eruption starts to get hot. It starts to burn, and that burning from the Pele clan is seen as noho, which is translated as spiritual possession. But in fact, for us, it's the idea that our ancestor, our deity, the leader of our clan, is occupying, residing in, or habituating in herself. And she does this to the land. She also does this to her descendants. And so it's an interesting, and it's difficult for me to talk about this in English, but it's this idea of noho and hulihia includes this idea that Pele can kind of, I'll just use that word, possess the land and her descendants' bodies because she doesn't see them as not her. All of that is her. And so it gives this really productive frustration of the idea of who owns what, who belongs to what, who possesses what. And it kind of, it throws everything up into hulihia. And so, for me, this is where my indigeneity in a positive way helps me to think of future ways, present ways to prefigure, to use an anarchist term, to prefigure ways of living and being and relating that don't have to rely on these ideas of property or of the state. And it kind of stresses the need to actually have to think and practice and dance and behave creatively, even aesthetically, in order to find that to follow our desire and to find those ways of being that, we don't have to own any entities, right? Like it's about relating and caring for, and being accountable and responsible, where we don't have to look to this, the state that, pretends to own and control everything. And yet, the earth erupts and it's like, well, yeah, that was a myth. But yeah, so that's kind of the positive aspects of how I incorporate some of my, some of the indigenous philosophy specific to the Pele family and the Pele clan into my anarchism. In terms of a negative, though, there are negative things. Like one of my friends, Gregory Pomai Gushkin, they say just because it's indigenous, just because a concept, philosophy, or practice is indigenous, doesn't make it innocent. Yeah, and that's very true when indigeneity, as it has been theorized, as it has been practiced, begins to converge with very problematic settler structures of colonization. One of them being something that I'm seeing right now is this convergence with anti-Blackness, white supremacy, and fascism even. During the Trump administration and even to now, we've been seeing this, the assimilation, co-optation of Hawaiian indigenous resistance to colonization, to the occupier, to the United States power. We're seeing this kind of bizarre move and proximity toward whiteness, where you have Hawaiians standing up for blue lives and standing against Micronesians, like I remember Saikap, who was murdered this year, or Lindani Mieni, South African royalty, actually, who was murdered as well, almost around the same time, like 1 week between these deaths. And so when that happened, you saw Hawaiians like standing up for the police and their actions of killing people of color and children of color. Actually, I remember I was a minor. And so you're seeing these kinds of convergences there. You're also seeing strong republicanism, strong conservative elements, and all the contradictions that come with that. You have Hawaiians who are, right now saying, we want to have the choice to be vaccinated or not, while at the same time, going against women's reproductive health. And of course, the church, Christianity really facilitates that, contradiction and paradox. But you're also seeing it elsewhere. For example, you're seeing deoccupation, folks who argue for the deoccupation of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and they're, the ousting of the American occupier, weirdly allying with Americans who do not have their interests, not even their best interests, just any interest at all in mind. And so, in a way, when indigeneity starts to become proximate to, hypermasculinity, patriarchy, white supremacy, anti-blackness, that's where I have this troubling relationship. And, there is an explanation. It's not just because, indigeneity is like that, but rather because you see again, it goes back to the state crafting, right? The state as a white patriarchal structure of colonization and imperialism was incorporated, sometimes agentively by our own leadership from during the Hawaiian Kingdom period. In fact, the adoption of monarchical structures, the tripartite division of the government, etc. These are all, there were resistances, there was Hawaiian aspects to it, but there was also a growing proximity to Europe and America. And I understand why that happened. It was, statecrafting was done so that, another power wouldn't come in and completely, wipe us out or have a quick way of doing that. Still, overthrow, it happened, the events occurred, and we're currently in the political situation that we're in now. But I think that, this proximity to Euro-American whiteness has had some really damaging effects on how we think of indigeneity. And for that reason, I actually think these engagements with anarchism are really important because it allows us to recenter, really these real historical critiques of the state, of the market, of capitalism, of patriarchy, and of all the archies, right? And I think right now, where you're getting this binarized, what would have been, I would have thought a couple of years ago, a strong resistance to anti-blackness and, a strong resistance to anti-blackness and white supremacy. But now today, kind of a growing incorporation of that, or a resurgence of that. I think right now anarchism and its critiques, it's on the ground making relations, with those folks who are impacted by anti-blackness, white supremacy, and fascism. That is extremely important, and I think that's where I actually kind of move away from indigeneity for a bit and kind of merge more towards with anarchism, because it supplements a very needed perspective, in my opinion, along with like feminism and other critical movements. Yeah. So.
Well, thanks for sharing the complexities of that question with me and our listeners. And I was reflecting on my own condition as a white descendant of Europeans in Canada, and the tremendous work that needs to be done as an anarchist to overthrow many of the modes of oppressions that you're outlining, and the weight of that legacy that bears down on my consciousness and conception of radicality, and strategies also for building alliances outside of a white context, of course, towards a shared liberation. So, yeah, thanks so much for that.
Yeah.
I'd like to turn now to some of the resistance actions on the islands, because of course they've been happening. And one of them is opposition to the construction of a massive telescope on a sacred mountain on Hawaii's biggest island. And you've been involved in that struggle. Could you tell us about it?
Yeah, so the struggle to prevent the desecration of Mauna Kea and all our mountains, really, but Mauna Kea by the proposed 30-year telescope project, it is still a success. That telescope has not been built, and that is due to the efforts, really, of like beyond the 2015 standoffs. It's efforts of Kealoha, Pisciota, Kuching, folks like Maxine, Haulilio, who have really, like, for decades, like 20 plus years, have been standing for the mountain in court and in various other institutions of the occupier and the colonizer, resisting that and trying to stop it. In 2015, you see, more. That's where we come, me and my partner, and our relations come in, where we helped to create a stand and to actively resist through through direct action. Police forces attempting to help transport materials for the telescope up to Mauna Kea. So 2015 and 2019, that was the periods where you see my partner and I were more involved. Previous to that, we had actually been involved in trying to stop the Daniel K. Inouye Solar Telescope from being constructed on Haleakala. That telescope, unfortunately, was built. However, our experience in that action helped us to prepare us for the 2019 Mauna Kea standoffs. My partner and I went up to the mountain. We helped to establish what we call a pu'uhonua. A pu'uhonua is literally a raised ground. It's also related to, like, sanctuary, refuge, spaces of refuge and sanctuary. And so this pu'uhonua was created as a way to protect the protectors, while the protectors of the mountain were standing for Mauna Kea. And so we stayed up there for 8 months. We helped to found a university, which is really in a direct action period, a place of educating the masses of people who helped build the pu'uhonua and came up to stand in solidarity with Hawaiians for our sacred places. We also helped to found two organizations, the Hale Wahine, which is a house for women identified folks, cis, trans, non-binary, etc., as well as the Hale Mahu, who my other sister, Kalani Young, helped to found, and that was a place for queer, trans, LGBTQ folks. Mahu is our word for that community, and so we helped to provide spaces up there for. To create space to, like, a sanctuary within that sanctuary for those who are oftentimes marginalized. But in that camp, we found a place. We found places to work with other Kanaka and activists, protectors. You saw this, like, bourgeoising, beautiful movement of Kanaka and allies providing for Kanaka and allies, and really in that space we did the work of prefiguring what we want. We were able to have the Hale Ho'olako, which was a provisioning house led by Alika Kinimanava, and really before him, Dr. Maria Lohalani Brown, who provided, like, they took in donations and provided for the camp. You also had other, Uilani, Auntie Uilani from the kitchen, who, she took in food donations and was able to cook and distribute that food in the camp. We had Mauna medics under Dr. Kalamani Hill and Noilani Ahia, my partner's sister, who provided this, like, beautiful multi-purpose healthcare and emergency response team on there. And there was just so many others, Kanaka Rangers, Kapu Aloha crew, the ritualists on the road who took care of our spiritual and ritual needs. It was the movement of our lifetime, and we were grateful to be a part of that. And currently, what's happened is that there are still protectors on the mountain, the Nake'ipa'a, who are continuing to maintain a stand and watching the road in case TMT or the state tries to make any movements to transport things. But off the island, off the mountain, we also have folks engaged in stopping there's an ongoing process about the lease over the mountain. Manoa purports to be the adjudicator of that lease and whatnot. But currently that lease is kind of being up in the air. And so Manoa just released its master plan regarding how the mountains should be used or treated, and that plan includes TMT. And so, what folks like on Oahu, who are close to Manoa and are present there, folks like Healani Sunora Pale and Kalahui Hawaii have been doing. They've been pressuring and telling them, we never consented to the TMT, and we still don't consent to the TMT, and you just need to end that. So that's where we are currently. No telescope on the Mauna. We're resisting that lease agreement, that master plan, and it kind of looks so far like there may or may not be a standoff. We are also trying to prepare for the worst case scenario as well.
Okay, so you've mentioned a few things, terms that people might not be familiar with. UH is University of Hawaii?
Yes, University of Hawaii.
And TNT?
30-meter telescope.
30-meter telescope. And this telescope project was first proposed when?
I think I'm not really sure. I have to check up on that.
Not a problem. But in terms of direct action resistance, that kicked off in 2015?
Yes, that was probably the first instance of or large-scale organized direct action. But there were others.
Before that, there was like consciousness raising and so forth, and a program of Indigenous Hawaiians protesting against this planned desecration, I'll call it that.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, okay. Because it's interesting how the educational component and the direct action component, when they come together, effectively, they're so powerful. My understanding is that although the University of Hawaii was spearheading the construction of this telescope, it's financed, hypothetically. Of course, it hasn't been built, but the financing is coming from various states around the globe. I mean, there's different players involved, including the Canadian state.
Right.
Yeah, and so and your actions have led to various universities in Canada that had some sort of affiliation with future involvement in using the telescope and everything to say, hold off. We're calling for consultation with the Indigenous peoples of Hawaii. Nothing that's going to be done that will violate what they consider to be their rights and so forth. So it's been really effective. But as far as I could see, it was you folks hitting the ground hard, occupying, standing up, refusing to go away. That was the key.
Yeah, and again, and thanks, and we also couldn't have done it without there's also our allies and other Kanaka in the diaspora who are also pushing those initiatives. So I also want to thank those who've been with us, because again, that educational piece too was it helped to propel others outside of Hawaii to take up the cause. And so mahalo.
Yeah. How did you negotiate the confrontations with the police? That's something that we're dealing with in various ways all the time.
It's an interesting situation. So so those who organized the direct action, they did have police liaisons who while we're on the front lines, if any of the police approached, they did the typical thing like, okay, go to the police liaison and deal with them. Don't talk to the police. Don't try to negotiate or give information. So we had that on the front lines and set up. But in terms of kind of more the larger issue of police and their, where they are situated between the ongoing resistance in the state. The interesting thing with Hawaii's police is that first and foremost, the police entity was actually a part of the Hawaiian kingdom. So that's where you had, they actually traced their genealogy to, the Hawaiian kingdom period. And because of that, you also see this continuation and conscription of largely Hawaiian men into the police. And so you have a body that's lots of men of color, lots of Hawaiian men of color, while also having, it's still a very, white structured organization. And so on the mountain, it was a very difficult situation, especially when Black Lives Matter rose again with us, almost simultaneously. And so you saw like this kind of like aloha, like a love for our Hawaiian men who are in the police, with this kind of non-dealing, like a refusal to deal with the fact that it's still a white supremacist institution. And so we had this kind of, I didn't agree with it. I didn't agree with this discourse, but it was kind of this idea of like, Hawaiian police, because they're not like the continental United States police, where it's largely white folks. We could intercourse with them, and we could, challenge. And there was a tactical use of that. When the Hawaiian police were looking at a lot of their like Hawaiian teachers from their immersion classes, their children were that's their teachers that teach them, and when they saw their aunties and uncles and community members, it caused a lot of them to break down. Some of them quit or refused to stand. The majority, nonetheless, held the line. And so, for me, I didn't like that discourse of it kind of left Hawaiian men off the hook who were involved there. Mm-hmm. And that became actually a really big problem when Black Lives Matter rose the summer of 2020, because you actually saw people standing up for the police because they felt that Black Lives Matter and abolitionists were attacking Hawaiian men who were involved with the institution. And so, again, that proximity piece causes a lot of issues. And so you saw kind of this distancing between Mauna Kea people who are protecting the mountain, but who are also against the abolitionist initiatives. Yeah.
Okay. Well, what an interesting situation to be able to appeal to the indigeneity of the people in the police force and have some of them walk away from what they were doing. What was did you assert a language of sovereignty in relation to the mountain? You mentioned it's officially within the parlance of the state leased. Who leases it, and who do they lease it from?
Right, exactly. And that was a really big message. Is that it's one that the state didn't want to take up. Who has actual or sovereignty to the mountain and whatnot. So that was actually pushed. It was pushed along with the we don't consent.
Yeah, those are very effective and clarifying, I think, politically and on a whole bunch of different levels, clarifying tactics for taking an oppositional situation or a resistance struggle to the next level. In terms of, again, consciousness raising, right? On the ground and also in the press releases and so forth. So, yeah, fantastic. What other resistance actions have you been involved in?
Currently, on Maui, on the island of Maui, my family and I are involved in a court case regarding our ancestral lands. And so My family is currently reoccupying this land that's in contestation between us and an affordable housing development, which it's not affordable at all. It's just one of those, money-making ventures. But basically, our family has been reoccupying that land for, it's been a couple of months already. And we're making our stand based off of a couple of things. We are looking at native title that was secured during that Mahele period in the Hawaiian Kingdom. My family has documents providing our belonging to that land and our ancestors filing for allodial title to those lands. But we're in addition to that, because this has been kind of an ongoing discussion with me and my family, is that I've tried to tell them, while property is a thing that we have to deal with because of the occupier and the colonizer, it's also important that we look at ways that we go beyond that and invoke more indigenous models and relations that don't go to property ownership. And so one of them is like allowing, for example, converging our movement to reoccupy our lands with houseless Hawaiian movements to survive, really. And so we've been trying to create a site where basically all Hawaiians back to our lands and is our message. And so what that looks like for us as a family is we're using our titled lands that we got through the Mihele as a space to provide folks who don't have Hawaiians and other houseless folks who don't have a place to go to stay there for time being, because the welfare system is not very good at all in its treatment of houseless folks. So currently that's what we're doing right now. It's a direct action. We've had to confront same issues like on Mauna Kea, police, white developers, all sorts of things like that. So, and currently I'm in a court case in November, having to confront challenges to our title. So, yeah.
Thanks. So reoccupation.
Yep.
Yeah. Fantastic. So how many people are involved in the occupation? Have you built structures on the land?
So we have tents. We have, I believe, a kitchen. We have about a couple, maybe like 24 people who part of the extended family who rotate shifts on who's on the land so that folks can go to work and all that stuff. In a weird way, the pandemic was kind of a useful period of time to do this because, work, a lot of the work went online, and so a lot of us have more time to be on the land and whatnot. We've also, in addition to that, we've also been planting. So It's not just housing, and it's not just direct action against frontline. It's also thinking about the future. So we've planted traditional fiber plants, food plants, medicinal plants from our traditional, our medicinal plant nations, I guess you would say. And so a lot of my family have also been practicing their making fiber arts and fiber cloth, cooking, chanting, learning about our family's ties to that place. And so again, a lot of this again comes because of our experience from Mauna Kea and taking what we learned there back to Maui.
Are there any other Indigenous Hawaiians taking up this strategy?
Yes, it's actually a really growing movement right now. It started with Keaumoku Kapu and Uilani Kapu in Lahaina on the island of Maui, same island. They have engaged again in a 20 plus year fight against the white corporate developer. They won a case which recognized that if the title of heirs to claims made in the Mahele have standing an interest in the lands, and that developers can't just come in and just push them out. And so we've actually learned from their efforts. They've been reoccupying their land for years, and that has turned into an educational piece and a community organizing movement. And so you have people in Lahaina, West Maui, as well as one of my friends who's up in Coup on the east side of Maui, who's also reoccupying their land and dealing with some plantation, corporate plantation interests regarding water rights. So it's actually, and recently they've also done what we call a ka'apuni, which is a traditional march around the island during this kind of this season at the end of the year. And this march, which is happening right now, it's actually happening right now. It's going to end today. This march has been an educational piece going around the island to talk to Hawaiian families about reoccupying their land in the various districts across Maui. So they took with them signs, information sheets about the families' lands and titles so that they could present that to the families so that, you know, it puts everyone on notice, particularly the settler colonizers and occupiers that, you know, we're back, we're coming back for our lands, we're reoccupying.
That's very inspiring. And thanks so much for sharing that.
Of course.
I guess I had one more question for you. I was reading a piece that you co-wrote on anarchism and indigeneity. And one of the things you talked about in that piece was the seeming paradox of the Hawaiian assertion of nationhood. Of course, you've related already in response to my first question, the historical context for this concept of nationhood, which is based on past treaties and also interstate recognition. You know, could you elaborate on the difference between the concept of a nation as opposed to a state?
Sure.
And so, you know, how you might negotiate that mode of sovereignty association assertion in relation to your anarchism.
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the conversations I love having on the differences between nations and states, and particularly when it comes to Hawaiian concepts. And so I would say that the state is a lot more restrictive. Even like the state idea of what is sovereign is extremely restrictive, and largely comes from that geopolitical Euro-American tradition of controlling people and places, and, you know, excluding the control. Very patriarchal, very. But unfortunately, nation too can sometimes, you know, we do have histories of nationalism, you know, turning into very, very much similar, you know, oppressing movements. However, from a Hawaiian perspective, and the perspective that I bring to my concepts of nationhood, is the idea of lahui. And so lahui is a very open term. So it means it gets translated or interpreted as nation, but it actually can also include non-human or more than human elements. And so we talk of like plant lahui, animal lahui. And so we see like nationhood, nationality as extending beyond our Kanaka experience to also include the land, to include other more than human ancestors on that land. And so for us, or for me, how I see it is that when we talk about international relations in kind of the Western or colonizing perspective, that's like between, it really should be called interstate relations. Yeah. But for me, when I think of internationality, it actually happens when it's like Kanaka, Hawaiians, humans even, with other species, with other deities even. That's actually where the international comes from. And so it's broader, it's more inclusive, and it also challenges the idea of sovereignty, because for us, the Hawaiian word for sovereignty is ea. Ea means to rise up, and it's actually another Pele kind of concept. It's not just rising up in terms of revolution, it's actually also rising up of the land from the ocean through volcanic activity. And so ea is also related to breath. It's air, oxygen. And so when you look at these kinds of things, our concepts of sovereignty are not about like a state entity dominating over the land and people. It actually has to do with land. And not as a dominating relationship, but in a relationship of reciprocity. And that relationship is practiced all the time through ea, our word for sovereignty, ea, which is breath, and to breathe. And I tell this to my students all the time. I'm like, if ea as sovereignty was like the colonizer sovereignty, which means I'm independent, I don't need anybody else, I'm sovereign, I control all the things. If you did that, that's kind of like holding your breath, saying that if I hold my breath, I am sufficient unto myself. But when you do that, you're going to strangle and choke and die. And so in reality, Hawaiian concepts of sovereignty and nationhood and relationship to land are actually more about interdependence, not about independence. They're about reciprocal relations with other humans, other beings, as well as species, non-humans, and whatnot. And so this idea, when we take that to the idea of lahui and nation, we have a much more expansive set of kinships, which really challenge the idea of the state. And I think that's where, for me, I resist, the statism of even like with the Hawaiian Kingdom, and of course the United States. And I guess for me, I want something more. And for me, nationality and nation has a bit more life, a little bit more prefigurative potential to create a different set of relations that don't have to look at the state and capitalism, but which of course have to deal with them, but is not restricted to them. So that I would say is my ideas of nationality. Nationality, lahuiness, comes from the land. It comes from our need to breathe, which is always tied to other beings, to the atmosphere, etc. And we can never be independent because of that. And that's not a bad thing, right? That's actually, it's an opening for relationships. And I think there's a lot of productive things for anarchists to think about that. And to reconsider, the critique of the nation and critique of the state.
Absolutely, and I reflect on the deep ecological trends in the European tradition of anarchism.
Yes,
and the ecological orientation expands beyond the European context when you look at anarchisms as they've emerged or developed in other places in the world. So thanks so much for this fantastic discussion.
Inviting me all the way.
Yes, and let's keep in touch.
Yes, take care, be safe. Yola.